Greetings to you all. I'm Fred Kemp, President and CEO of the Atlantic Council, and it's great to see such a full house. We realize after this very quiet and unmomentous weekend that there isn't much to worry about in the world. Seriously speaking, we see this as an inflection point in history as important as the end of World War I, World War II, and what the Atlantic Council stands for, working constructively alongside friends and allies to ensure constructive U.S. engagement in the world remains as relevant as ever. We're delighted to be partnering again with Bill Loers and the Iran Project for our third major event, Bill, on the Iran nuclear deal, and we've worked a lot even before that in getting there in the first place. We at the Atlantic Council have been doing concentrated work on Iran since 2010 when we inaugurated an Iran task force. I want to salute Barbara Slavin, who's been at the tippy point of the spear of getting all of that done. And I also want to salute Stu Eisenstadt, a member of the executive committee of the board of the Atlantic Council, and with Secretary Chuck Hagel, one of the co-chairs of the Future of Iran International Advisory Council, the Future Iran Initiatives International Advisory Council. The effort that we launched then is now the initiative I just named. The fate of the nuclear agreement will be a key determinant of U.S.-Iran relations going forward, and will have a broader impact on the Middle East and on non-proliferation more broadly. It has now been a year since the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action went into full implementation. The consensus is that Iran and the other parties to the agreement have largely met their obligations, but there is discontent about the impact of the deal on both sides. Iranians have not seen the economic benefits they expected, and the United States is concerned that Iran has not altered other policies regarding regional intervention and human rights. We've assembled two excellent panels to discuss both the nuclear agreement and the regional implications. We are also honored to welcome after the first panel Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut to discuss the deal from the congressional point of view. And so we're very delighted that he will take time out of his very crowded schedule to join us. With that, I turn the podium over to Bill Loers to provide some welcoming remarks.
Thank you, Fred, and thanks to the Atlantic Council and to my partner, Barbara Slavin, and the staff here, which is so remarkable. This is a well-run organization, and as you all know, it's a good place to come for these things. This is, as Fred said, the third time we've done this together. We like the partnership. It works for us. It gives us an important audience in Washington, and we try to provide an important audience for this issue in New York. This is the first time we've had one of these in which the Iran nuclear deal isn't front page news. I'm hoping that the wisdom that will come out of this meeting will be such that it won't have to be or ever again be front page news. I think I'm being a little optimistic, but do what you can. The final thing I'd say is that we have prepared for you a summary of this Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which is a 159-page document. It's probably the most complex international nuclear agreement I've ever seen. And we have taken it down to about 3 pages, and I hope it helps you understand what it's all about. So Barbara, thank you very much for coming, all of you.
Thanks everyone for coming. And as Bill said, we're delighted to have this collaboration again with the Iran Project. Before we get to our first panel, though, I wanted to say just a word about the news of the past few days. Many of us have been worried about the fate of the nuclear deal under the Trump administration, but I think we never anticipated that the first blow would come in the form of a ban on ordinary Iranians coming to the United States. The Iranian media is already calling this a violation of the JCPOA, and this is something we're obviously going to discuss. on our panels, but I just wanted to say personally, as someone who's worked on Iran at the Atlantic Council for 6 years and has been visiting Iran for 20 years, that I hope the Trump administration will reconsider the visa ban or at least not extend it. And with that, I'm going to introduce our panelists for our first panel. Carolyn Vicini is deputy head of the delegation of the European Union to the United States. She's a former Swedish diplomat and oversees overall management of the delegation, including chairing a weekly meeting of DCMs for coordination among the 28 EU member states. Carolyn will be followed by Mark Dubowitz, and I'm delighted that he accepted our invitation to come. Mark is the executive director of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. He co-leads FDD's Center on Sanctions and Illicit Finance, and he's been very influential on Capitol Hill in terms of designing sanctions on Iran, and he's also been a very prominent critic of Iran, so we welcome his, and of the JCPOA, so we welcome his voice. Then we'll have Jim Walsh from MIT. Jim has worked on nuclear issues involving the Middle East and East Asia, and he's testified frequently on Capitol Hill on Iran and North Korea. And then finally, Ellen Leibson, Distinguished Fellow, President Emeritus at the Stimson Center. Ellen spent 25 years in U.S. government service, including stints on the National Intelligence Council, NSC, and policy planning staff of the State Department. She wrote an excellent paper for the Atlantic Council last year, which is on our website. I recommend it to you. It's called A New Strategy for U.S.-Iran Relations. And finally, for those of you who are in the Twitter business, the hashtag is ACIran, and I hope that you will tweet on this event. And we welcome you, and we welcome our panelists to the stage. Thank you. Okay. Well, there isn't much to talk about, is there? Carolyn, first, thank you so much for agreeing to be with us. When I think of the EU role in all of this, I think of Cathy Ashton and Federica Mogherini and Helga Schmidt. So it's appropriate that we have a woman from the EU, I think, here, given the role that the EU played in organizing and helping the negotiations along. So if you could just tell us from the European perspective, how well has the deal been implemented? What are the problems, the challenges that you see going forward?
Yeah, as was just pointed out by Fred Kemp, we have just now passed the first anniversary of the implementation of the agreement, and therefore I want to thank the Atlantic Council, because I think this is very, very timely, because I think it's just after, I mean, a year is a good time for a first assessment. We are often eager to want to go and assess things after 1 week and say, well, it works, it doesn't work. I think a year can give us somewhat of a perspective on how this is working. And for the EU, this has been a huge undertaking in many senses, both the negotiations, where the EU as such was very involved in, as you just described. We also have the EU member states who are engaged in this agreement and were part of the negotiations. And it must be underlined that all the 28 member states have sort of agreed to this and is a part of constructing the EU's views on the implementation of the agreement. We think it has been a successful first year. Iran has, by and large, complied with the agreement. There had been a few minor issues. Those have been detected and corrected immediately, which we think is very good. I mean, that is an important part. Mistakes can always happen, and the important thing is how they are dealt with, and that they are dealt with promptly and in agreement. We also are being very engaged in trying to provide the other side of the agreement, but because of Iran giving up their abilities to get to a nuclear weapon, they have asked for lifting of the sanctions, which was done immediately upon the implementation. But also, of course, to restart the trade so they get some economic benefit out of it. As you pointed out, there has been complaints. This is not going fast enough. This is not happening as it should, etc. Well, there are different reasons for that. The Iranian society and their private sector is not very easy to deal with. It's not somebody you do quick business with. So there are many contacts that, due to the sanctions, have been laying down for many, many years. Those contacts have to be renewed, and before you get to deals and before they are you can show them in numbers, it takes quite a while. There has also been some issues around the banking system, and we have worked very intensively with our American counterparts here to try to solve them and to try to provide guidance to the European banking system, where many are, for a reason, worried that if they do business with Iranian banks, that will have repercussions on their U.S. business. And anybody can understand, if you have to choose between the U.S. and Iran, what you choose. So there have been a number of initial obstacles, but that we are working every day to solve, and we are very confident that Iran will see the advantages, and that Iran is also, by this, getting more to people contacts, which we think is also beneficial for the country as such.
Okay.
Maybe I stop there and we will
Stop
get
there.
to
Yeah,
the
we'll
details
we'll go deeper on a next round. Mark, again, thank you for being here. What is your impression of how well the deal has been implemented over the last year, and in particular, what do you anticipate in terms of sanctions? Because we've heard that many Republicans on Capitol Hill want to impose sanctions on other issues that in some cases replicate the nuclear sanctions or go beyond them.
So, Barbara, first of all, thank you for inviting me. First time at the Atlantic Council. I want to congratulate you and Fred and others here on a tremendously successful organization, and I'm glad that you've brought together different perspectives and different voices. I think it's going to be critical in this new administration and this new era that both deal critics and deal supporters kind of put our heads together and try to figure out the way forward. From my perspective as a deal critic, I think the deal has gone as expected, which is that Iranians are testing the deal by incrementally violating it to see what our response will be, but that ultimately the Iranians actually the regime has no incentive to violate the deal, certainly not yet, because it gives Iran a patient pathway to nuclear weapons as a result of these sunset provisions. So if Iran is smart, they won't violate the deal. They won't even test the deal incrementally. They'll just wait for these restrictions to disappear over time and emerge with an industrial-sized nuclear program with near-zero nuclear breakout and advanced centrifuge-powered clandestine sneak-out, an ICBM program and a large economy, perhaps $1 trillion economy at that point, which will be, to some extent, immunized against our ability to use sanctions as a tool, of course, of power. So I think the deal from an Iranian perspective is going quite well, and I think we have to certainly be on guard as we move forward to deter these violations, but also to figure our way out from under the deal, and I'll say a few more words about that in a moment. From my perspective, I think the Trump administration is adopting the right posture early out of the gate, which is not to abrogate the deal. I've been on record for many months now saying that would be a big mistake. Mm-hmm. The deal should be kept. It should be vigorously enforced. The provisions that the Iranians are interpreting in their favor, provisions I think the United States has disagreed with, we should be very strict in interpreting the ambiguities in the deal. And then we should do what President Obama and Secretary Kerry said we always should do, which is use non-nuclear sanctions to deter Iran's malign activities in the region. And I think that's, if you were to predict where Congress and this new administration were to go in the next 12 months, my guess, and it's only a guess, would be that you'll see non-nuclear sanctions being the centerpiece of any new sanctions effort, both from Congress and from the new administration. And there's much to do on that front. As everybody knows, the Iranians have been testing missiles, including I saw a report today that they've test-fired another missile hostage taking, supporting Bashar Assad's slaughter in Syria, supporting designated Shiite militias, supporting the Houthi rebels, and human rights abuses that have gotten worse, not better, since the JCPOA. So I think there's much that can be done outside the JCPOA, and I would expect that you'll see that from the new administration.
Okay, very good. Jim, your perspective on how well the deal has been implemented, and given what Mark just said, whether these kinds of sanctions, even if you call them non-nuclear, will have the effect of undermining the deal, and also the visa ban, frankly, because as I said, I think Kayhan newspaper this morning already called it a violation of the JCPOA. In fact, they said that it's the result of the weakness of our country's negotiating team and the fruit of trusting the false promises of the United States. So that's not very helpful.
Well, on that note, let me say thank you. It's good to be here with friends, with this esteemed panel. Mark and I have been on TV together so many times. It's so nice to be in person. This way we can actually,
hug.
Hug. I was grabbing your throat, whatever. And to thank the Atlantic Council and all of you. I must say I'm delighted and stunned to see you all here. It's a full house. I thought probably no one would care anymore, and yet you've all come out, which says something about you, I think, and it may be a positive thing or a negative thing. I'm not sure. That you're JCPOA groupies, I guess is what it means. But I'm glad you're here because it is an important topic. And I would say briefly a couple of things. Yes, it's the 1-year anniversary, but we seem to forget we had 2 years of an interim agreement. Yeah. Right? We're 3 years into a nuclear agreement that the IAEA every couple of months has confirmed is being obliged with. That's 3 years of track record. And that's pretty impressive. And when you put that together with the data, the social science data about the effect that nuclear agreements have on nuclear behavior, I think that should give us some confidence going forward. We've had tremendous success in nuclear nonproliferation. Countries that were interested in weapons started down that path, stopped and turned back. An outstanding record. Some 40 countries had shown interest in nuclear weapons, stopped and reversed course. Often that happens as a result of nonproliferation agreements. And here we have what is, in my view, the strongest nonproliferation agreement ever negotiated. Stronger than the NPT, stronger than the PSI, stronger than the Libya deal. So we have a track record of success generally. We have a track record of success for 3 full years, verified by the IAEA. And then we have this agreement, which itself, I think, stands out compared with other agreements. But, that doesn't mean we're all going to get along and everything will be rosy. But this is, after all, a nuclear agreement. And it should be judged first and foremost by the nuclear components of the agreement and whether Iran is abiding by them. Caroline mentioned it, I take a notice and heart in the fact that there have been disagreements. There have been incidents that have come up, just like with the U.S. and the Soviets during U.S.-Soviet arms control. There were agreements or disagreements or implementation issues that come up. And in every case, we've been able to bring attention, concerns about something, and those concerns have been resolved. Now, Mark's inclined to call that testing the agreement. I don't see it that way. There wasn't any sort of prolonged, this isn't Saddam Hussein with prolonged refusals and dodging and all of that. The things have been resolved quite quickly, and I think that's a healthy sign. Now, I will take a moment and talk about what we might expect in the future. Mark has said that he expects, I must say that critics have predicted everything except that the agreement will succeed. They predicted that there would be breakout. They predicted that there would be undeclared facilities. They predicted salami tactics. They predicted, no, the agreement's going to work well. Well, if you make a prediction about every outcome, eventually you'll probably get one right. My view is that when it comes to Iran's nuclear intentions, I follow the lead of the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence. What does the DNI say? The DNI does not say Iran is chomping at the bit and waiting to build a nuclear weapon after 15 years. The DNI says, and has said repeatedly at high confidence since 2007, that Iran had a nuclear weapons program, that it halted in 2003, that it has not made a decision to build nuclear weapons. Repeatedly has said that, and said that that decision is a political one, not a technical one. Because if you can enrich, if you know how to build a centrifuge, right, you can make nuclear weapons. You have a nuclear weapons capability already. But they had not made a decision about what to do with that. So I'm going to go with the DNI on this, about this judgment. And so the question is, how do we maintain that going forward? How do we strengthen that so that the path Iran ends up 5, 10, 15 years down the road is one where it's not even a consideration? It goes from not a decision to not a consideration. And it seems to me having success with the agreement in which all parties benefit is the way to achieve that. Now, Mark has said that the agreement is going well from an Iranian perspective. That's not what a lot of Iranians say, but you know, they didn't like an extension of the sanctions that were extended by Congress. They've had complaints about the implementation and whether they were getting sufficient banking sanctions relief, all the rest. So we hear a lot of complaining. But at the end of the day, I think both sides, all sides I should say, because it's not a U.S. agreement, it's an international agreement, all sides have come to the conclusion that this is in everyone's interest to pursue. And as long as we focus on that, as long as the agreement serves the interests of its parties, then it can be sustained and we will prevent Iran from attaining a nuclear weapon. The moment, though, we start to play at the edges and start to try to deny benefits promised under the agreement so that parties do not receive the benefits they expect, then it will not be in the self-interest of those parties to stay in the agreement. So we may not like Iran, we didn't like the Soviet Union, but in the real world of international diplomacy, what you have to have is win-win. Both sides have to see it as in their self-interest in order to sustain this. So I hope that we don't take actions, well-intentioned or ill-intentioned, that Congress might take. You know, if you have a set of sanctions and you just cross out the word nuclear and you put in human rights or something else, but it's the same set of sanctions and you pass those, well, that's a shell game. And that's not going to be seen as being consistent with the agreement. If Iran is doing specific things that warrant specific responses by the U.S., we are absolutely entitled under the agreement to use all the tools at our disposal. But I hope as we make choices about that, it'll be a more reasoned and particular set of judgments than I've seen discussed in the press and in the public so far. So let me pause there. I've gone on for too long, as usual. But we've got a better person bed and cleanup here, so she'll save me from myself, I hope.
Yeah. Ellen, put it in a broader strategic perspective. I'm hearing the suggestion that we need at some point to negotiate a follow-on agreement. Even though the preamble to the agreement says that Iran will never build nuclear weapons, obviously given what Mark has said and what we hear, there is a lot of suspicion that Iran could just abide by the deal and then, you know, in 10, 15 years start to work covertly on a nuclear weapon again. So how do you see this sort of as a way to shore it up or improve it? Or is that something we should even be talking about now?
So thanks, Barbara. So I do think that part of the conceptual, not confusion, but the conceptual differences that we hear continuously in the debate over the Iran nuclear agreement is different assumptions about what were Iran's intentions even during the negotiating period, whether in fact you accept the DNI's judgment that a decision had not yet been made, or whether others believe that this was a country that had already made the decision that nuclear weapons would be a strategic asset to a vulnerable country and that it was a legitimate national security choice that they could make. So there's the sort of going back to what were the Iranians' intentions at the beginning, and then also what did the final diplomatic achievement, what were the parameters of that achievement? What was it intended to do and what was it not intended to do? And we seem to circle back to divergent expectations about what the agreement was intended to do. In the report that I did last year that you very kindly mentioned, I said, let's think of the agreement as a new baseline in U.S.-Iran relations. It doesn't mean that it's sufficient to solve any of the other problems, but it does set a new reality and it creates a new context where American and Iranian officials can actually talk to each other. And I think one of the great worries of the handover to a new administration that has very strong views on Iran is that there wasn't enough value given to the continuity of those contacts. So I worry that now we're in a post-nuclear agreement political environment that has some new dynamics to it. So I think it's not necessarily realistic to think that anybody has the stomach to go back to the negotiating table and say a formal new diplomatic process. I think that it's more likely to happen ad hoc when the Iranians test certain provisions, or when the IAEA or any one of the signatories believes that Iran is up to the line of compliance or non-compliance. I think in the end what we're going to have is ad hoc, problem solving. And nobody's mentioned yet the Joint Commission. I mean, you alluded to it indirectly, but there is a very interesting and important mechanism that I believe has met 6 times. I don't know how often. I think they meet 4 times.
4 times.
Where any party to the agreement can bring issues. And again, this is not, the parties to the agreement are not peers in the sense that it's Iran that was in the penalty box. So it's not that each party has to demonstrate its own compliance as peers of Iran. It's really that Iran has to demonstrate first and foremost compliance, and then there's an adjudication process if there was a misunderstanding about how long they could hold a quantity of heavy water before they had to export it, et cetera. So there are some, but that mechanism seems to be working at a tier below, the cabinet level officials, and one would hope that that could keep going. So, in one of the year-end assessments of the nuclear agreement, one very fine analysis suggested that the narrowness and the specificity of the nuclear agreement was also a vulnerability, because it wasn't sufficient to solve all the other problems. I would say the narrowness and the specificity was a virtue and a strength of the agreement, because for the first time after decades of non-transactional interaction with Iran, it gave us something concrete and measurable. We can say, on the basis of objective analysis, are they complying or are they not complying? And that, to me, is a strength more than a weakness, because all other aspects of U.S.-Iran relations are in a much more subjective domain, where it is in the eye of the beholder, how aggressive is Iran being in the region? Are the human rights violations, which unfortunately seem to be getting worse, not better, is Iran such an outlier in the region and in the world by human rights standards? What would make them more susceptible to changing their behavior on human rights, et cetera? So again, I think of the agreement as a concrete achievement that sets a new baseline or a new reality to think about all these other problems. It does not solve the big Iran problem. There is still, a multifaceted challenge, because Iran is, after all, a revisionist power in the region. They like to say, oh no, we're now a status quo power, we're for stability in the region, we're not for regime change in the region. But in fact, from the perspective of most other countries, Iran is challenging the order that, for what it's worth, as disorderly as the order may be. And so in theory, to me, again, just last point, it is that ability to engage government to government that in theory creates a different and better opportunity to talk to Iran about all these other issues. It has no automaticity that any of those other problems can be solved by this agreement. And then I think maybe later in the discussion we'll talk about these gray areas of when Iran says this is a violation. It's a violation of the spirit of the agreement, not necessarily the letter of the agreement. And how do we cope with that?
Caroline, given how long it took to get this deal, the many, many meetings, the hours and hours and hours, the numbers of diplomats who were involved, is there any appetite in Europe, with all the other problems Europe is dealing with now, such as Brexit and so on, for any kind of renegotiation? And is there any thought being given to how this deal would be extended, perhaps?
No, I think I can say with confidence that there is no appetite to renegotiate it. And that has nothing to do with Brexit or anything else. It has to do with that we believe that this is a good deal. It is the best deal we could get. I do completely agree with Ellen that the beauty of the deal is probably its narrowness, that it's possible to sort of control it and contain it. We had maybe hoped that this deal would set off a spiral of better relations in the region. Unfortunately, that has not happened, but there are also many other things going on and in the region at this time, so it's not a very propense time for better relations. We think both Iran and others could have used it better in that sense. But what is important to us is that Iran is now for a number of years deprived of the possibility to develop a nuclear weapon. And as we can see, history can change very quickly, overnight, kind of. So we don't know where we are going to be when we come to the sort of further end of this. I think we have just passed 1 year or 3 years, depending on how you see it, and we need to give it some more time. What is important is that the EU and also, I must say, China and Russia engage in filling sort of the other balance to make Iran keep up its promises. And I just want to say something. I spoke with a person who was deeply engaged in the negotiations on a very practical ground field level. And he said, and I will always remember that, you have to understand what the pride this was for Iran. We cannot really understand what a nationalistic pride it was for Iran to be able to develop a nuclear weapon. And now we are taking that away from them, or they are giving that away. And we have a group of people who were the sort of heroes of the country who all of a sudden are without a job practically. Mm-hmm. And it's up to the EU now to keep these people busy with good things and to put them on the peaceful use of nuclear power, nuclear safety, medical use of nuclear and other, to engage them in something that can sort of bring back their pride and national pride in this project. And I think that is a thought we seldom make. And I think we are very engaged on that track to provide alternatives. And that is something we remember from the Soviet Union when the Soviet Union split up and we all were worried about what was going to happen with the scientists, what was going to happen with the different nuclear sources that were spread in a pretty uncontrolled way. And the US was very active in that work together with many of us Europeans.
Mark, I've been having some chats with people on Capitol Hill in the last few weeks, and I've been hearing that on the Republican side, the intention is to put so much pressure on Iran that it walks away from the deal. I've heard this expressed to me several times now. Is that indeed what you see as a strategy in Congress on the Republican side? And if so, what is the logic behind it? Because we hear a lot about repealing and replacing things these days. And given how long it took to negotiate this deal, given that there is no real appetite for renegotiation, what would be the benefit to the United States of trying to push the Iranians out of the deal?
So, Barbara, I don't know who you talked to on the Hill. I think the overwhelming number of members that I speak to and staffers, I think the strategy is twofold. The strategy is, first of all, to pass a whole series of non-nuclear sanctions that are fully consistent with the JCPOA, again, as the Obama administration repeatedly assured us. And I would also give some credit to the folks that are designing these sanctions, both in Congress and in a new Treasury Department, that they have a pretty good idea of what's technically and legally possible.
Can you give a couple of examples, perhaps, of the sorts of things that they're
Sure.
contemplating?
Well, you should invite them to talk about what they're contemplating. I can tell you what I recommended publicly, and that is that, for example, I think we all agree, whether you think that there is Rouhani is a moderate or not a moderate, and there's been a lot of discussion in this town about that. Everybody can agree the Revolutionary Guards are a malign force, not only in Iran, but in the region. It may surprise you or not that there have only been 52 IRGC entities that were ever designated. So 25 individuals, 25 companies and 2 academic institutions that were being used by the IRGC for nefarious purposes. So what I've recommended is that there be a massive expansion of IRGC sanctions, including the number of designations. There are literally thousands of IRGC companies, front companies. My organization has a database. I think we're up to about 850 IRGC companies that we've identified that meet the 50% threshold test for designations. And there are thousands of more. And if you've seen the bills that were introduced in the last Congress, you see that there were ideas along these lines about increasing the number of designations, actually designating the IRGC as a terrorist organization. They're not currently designated under U.S. law. The Quds Force is. Certainly they would qualify for designation under either 13224, the executive order for material support for terrorism, or as a foreign terrorist organization. So again, recognizing the IRGC as a terrorist organization, designating it as such, and massively accelerating the number of IRGC designations would be a useful place to start.
And the reason for those designations would be what? Support for terrorism, missile tests? Okay.
Human rights abuses, you name it. So I think that the IRGC is certainly not disappointing for those who predicted that they would continue their malign activities, in fact would accelerate them. And unfortunately, as I think the New York Times and Reuters have reported, the IRGC to date has been the primary beneficiary of some of the deals that have gotten signed. I also want to make some point on this, because I think we need to put this to rest. The Iranian regime has been complaining they're not getting the economic relief they were promised. Well, they were never promised economic relief. Right? The United States, I think, quite wisely said, we're not going to be responsible for economic outcomes. Here's our obligation. We're going to de-designate a number of entities. We're going to suspend or lift sanctions on sectors and key pillars of your oil economy and your financial sector, but we're not going to guarantee you outcomes. And in fact, if you look at the outcomes, the Iranians are in a much better position than they were in 2013, when they were about 4 to 6 months away from a severe balance of payments crisis, when inflation unofficially was at 80%, when they had lost over 6.5% in GDP, where oil export revenues had declined at the time significantly. Their economy, in terms of their macroeconomic fundamentals, were in very, very bad shape. Now, if you fast forward to today, things aren't great by any measure. Things are a lot better by every measure. Right? The economy is growing 5 to 6%. Inflation is down into single digits. They've gotten access to over $100 billion in foreign exchange reserves, so they no longer face the prospect of a severe balance of payments crisis. So I think it's a big mistake, whether you're a deal supporter or a deal critic, to play into this Iranian narrative that they never got what they were promised. They never were promised economic outcomes. And their economic outcomes have actually been, by any measure, not bad. They've avoided severe economic crisis, and they're on a path to modest recovery. So I think it's important to underscore that, regardless of how regardless of your position on this deal, and regardless of your support or lack of support for new sanctions.
Of course, perception is everything. We had an event here last week where we had some new poll data that had been released that showed that most Iranians thought that they had not gotten what they were promised, and they tended to blame the United States for discouraging European companies from returning to Iran and setting up new barriers that were as bad as the old ones. So what you say is certainly technically correct, but of course the perception is different.
I think, Barbara, as any politician knows, always a big mistake to overpromise and underdeliver.
Yes.
Our politicians do it all the time. I think President Rouhani has done the same thing, and he may face the domestic consequences of that. So I also since I think I'm the only one on the panel who's
opposed.
Seems to be a deal critic. So there's obviously a lot to respond to. A little more time.
Yeah.
I won't take a lot of it. I think we're going to spend a lot of time. It seems like we're going to, on this panel, kind of relitigating the JCPOA, and I'm happy to do that, and been involved in lots of interesting debates on this. But I do think it's important, and I do adopt the position that we shouldn't be abrogating the deal. That we cannot fall. I don't think we should fall again into this trap that just because the Iranians are saying we're not going to renegotiate the deal, and just because the Europeans are saying we're not going to renegotiate this deal, that we should all just sort of throw up our hands and say, well, I guess we're not renegotiating this deal, so we're going to have to live with this deal. And I think that there's a big mistake in assuming that. I think there's a big mistake in assuming that in light of what a Trump administration has said repeatedly, and that is that this deal in its very design and its very architecture, provided some short-term benefits, but in the medium to long term is very dangerous for U.S. national security. Because this deal includes, as I said, these key sunset provisions, which the Iranians were very smart to negotiate, which ultimately gives Iran an industrial-sized nuclear weapons capability. Now, that doesn't mean the Iranians are going to actually use that capability. It doesn't mean they've made a decision to build a nuclear weapon, though one would suggest that given their decades-long record of nuclear mendacity, they weren't in the business of building a civilian nuclear program. They're clearly in the business of building a capability. And the deal itself is going to give them a very dangerous capability, which I think we should all be cognizant of. And again, it's an industrial-sized capability. It means that they're going to have unlimited enrichment capacity. It means that they have the ability to build an unlimited number of heavy water reactors. It means that they will be, as President Obama himself admitted, they will be literally days, if not hours away from a nuclear weapons breakout.
I think we get the point.
So can I just finish?
Sure.
So I think we've got to think through how do we set up a strategy where we address some of the fundamental flaws of the deal. And it's worth noting, and we can talk about this later, there's a history in the Cold War of us negotiating follow-on agreements with the Soviet Union while they had thousands of tip nuclear missiles aimed at our city. The notion that this is a sui generis situation in the history of arms control where we can't foresee or assume that there's going to be a follow-on agreement just because the other party is saying today they want to do it, I think would be a big mistake.
Okay. I want to bring our audience into this now because we have a very packed day, but I wanted to first call on Konstantin Serednikov. If you would raise your hand, we'll bring a microphone to you. Konstantin is head of the political and military section of the Embassy of the Russian Federation. We had asked the Russian ambassador to participate in this event, and he could not, but I'd love to have your thoughts. Do you think it's possible, following the old US-Russia model, that we could have some follow-on agreements to the JCPOA? And yeah.
First of all, thank you, Barbara, and thank you to the Atlantic Council to give me the opportunity to speak before such an distinguished audience.
Hold it closer to your mouth.
Oh,
Okay.
is that better?
Yes,
Yeah.
much better.
Well, thank you first of all to the Atlantic Council and to Barbara yourself to give me the opportunity to speak before such a distinguished audience and such a distinguished panel. First, I would like to say a couple of general points on how we assess the first year of the JCPOA political implementation. First of all, we believe that this is a real success. We see that everybody complies and do its hard and do its best not to violate. With regard to the Iranians, it is confirmed fully proved by the IAEA. Of course, during the last year, we had some minor issues, but we have the Joint Commission mechanism to deal with these issues, and it also proved its efficiency, and it was very, very helpful and instrumental in fine-tuning, if I could call it so. Russia, as a state, has a very active participation in the JCPOA realization. As all of you know, we made an arrangement with Iranians to ship out the stockpile, and we have this separate arrangement with them to convert the former enrichment facility for production of stable isotopes, and we're well underway. I should tell you, we're going forward regardless whatever we see around. So our general assessment of the situation around the JCPOA in its first year, that it's quite positive, and it was also confirmed by the Joint Commission meeting, the last one, which took place on the 10th of January in Vienna. Everybody shared this positive assessment overall. With regard to renegotiating different elements, I personally do not think that it's possible at this point. I personally took part. I was a member of Russian expert team to those negotiations, and I remember how they happened. It was a really unique exercise, and the atmosphere was special there, and it took a lot of efforts from all the parties. I'm afraid in the current situation we will not be able to, to repeat this exercise. And once again, this is my personal assessment.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate that. Harlan, I think you had a question. Well, why don't we go to you? And thank you. Okay, wait for the microphone.
I'm Harlan Ullman with the Atlantic Council. Thank you for your contributions. If this past weekend is representative of how the Trump administration may pursue foreign policy, given the sort of rough ride with Mexico and the situation with refugees, it is not inconceivable that for whatever reasons the Trump team could conclude to abrogate the JCPOA under whatever circumstances. So let's assume in a contingency that the United States Trump administration pulls out from the JCPOA. Could you speculate on what the consequences might be for the other signatories, for Iran, for the region, and the future of sanctions, please?
I'm going to give that to you, Carolyn, because how would the EU react if there's
Thank
no violation, but the US says, nope, we're out of it?
Thank you. First of all, I believe that this administration will get people in place who are specialized in all these different areas. We have a lot of competence all over in the administration on this, and I think they hopefully will use that competence. So, and what the first things we have heard, it was after the phone call with
King Salman of Saudi Arabia yesterday,
was that there was no immediate worry about this direction that you are pointing at. So we have to give the Trump administration the benefit of the doubt, absolutely. Then the EU is not alone in this. We have Russia, we have China, we have the other EU countries who are partners of this, and there is certainly not anything unilateral for the EU to do in a situation as such. I think what the HRVP has said is that we are, if
High Representative for Foreign Policy.
Exactly,
Okay.
which is the EU's foreign minister, so to say, Mrs. Mogherini, is that if this would happen, we would certainly look to try to keep the agreement going anyhow. If that would at all be possible, that's another question. I think it's a very complicated agreement, and whether, treaty-wise, when it comes to international law, etc., that would at all be possible. It has been also passed through the UN Security Council. I'm not expert enough to tell, but I think there is certainly for the EU, we believe that this is the right way to avoid that Iran develops nuclear weapons, which we think would be very dangerous for the region and for the world, and therefore we do want to try to do everything we can to maintain this agreement.
Okay.
Yeah, that is exactly another
Actually,
question.
you could ask Ali Vaez, who's sitting next to you. Ali, do you want to grab the microphone? Ali is with the International Crisis Group, and he's followed the nuclear talks very closely.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Well, it's hard to predict how the Iranians are going to react, but I think they have three options. They can either play victim, trying to drive a wedge between the US and the EU, try to, in that way, neutralize new US sanctions. But they can also retaliate. They can retaliate by reviving their nuclear program, or they can retaliate regionally. Let's remember that the US forces and Iranian forces are co-located in many places in Iraq and Syria. And that would be, of course, the beginning of an escalatory cycle on both sides that would revive the nuclear crisis altogether. And that's precisely what I want to ask Mark, because I wonder how you think the Iranians would respond to what you call non-nuclear sanctions, which I think at the end of the day, it's very hard to define non-nuclear sanctions that are also as effective as the nuclear sanctions once were. But how do you think the Iranians would react? Because many say that the critics who were not able to kill the deal with a gunshot are now trying to kill it with 1,000 paper cuts. Is that really the strategy? And second, on sunset clauses, I think, Mark, you're not a critic of the JCPOA. You're a critic of the NPT. Because at the end of the day, if a country is in compliance with the most rigorous inspection mechanism ever implemented for 15 years or more, if you take into account the interim agreement, do you still expect that country to be treated as a second-class citizen among other NPT member states? Thanks.
Good question. Well, Mark, you're on the spot now, I guess.
Thanks, Ali. Good to see you, by the way. So lots in that. I mean, I think, first of all, it absolutely is possible to distinguish between nuclear and non-nuclear sanctions, because it's possible to distinguish between nuclear and non-nuclear behavior. And so when we talk about non-nuclear sanctions, we're talking about using sanctions to respond to a whole range of Iran's malign activities that are outside of a nuclear deal and outside of Iran's nuclear program. And I can tell you there are lots of ways you can design very effective sanctions that are outside of the nuclear deal, that are non-nuclear sanctions, to respond to Iran's support for terrorism, its missile tests, its human rights abuses, etc. I'm not going to go into detail, but I'm sure you'll probably see in March or April some of these sanctions that are coming out of Congress and may come out of the Trump administration even earlier. So absolutely, and again, I think we should not fall into the trap of the Iranian narrative. I know the Iranian narrative on this. They came out with a letter, I think in 2015, when the Iranian ambassador sent a letter which was very clear, which we will treat all sanctions as a violation of the deal. So the notion here is that we have to accept the proposition that if we designate individuals who are responsible for brutal human rights repression, right, for abusing, torturing, and murdering Iranian citizens, then we should accept the proposition that that is a violation of the JCPOA. I'm sure you wouldn't accept that. I wouldn't accept that. I can't imagine too many people in the room would accept that proposition. We are absolutely able to use all instruments of American power to respond to Iranian aggression, and that would include, but not be limited, to non-nuclear sanctions. I think on the issue of the sunset provisions, look, the reality is Iran is in a class, not by itself, but it's in a class with North Korea. It's a country that has engaged in decades of nuclear mendacity. It is a country that conducted militarization and weaponization of its program. And by the way, it is a country that never fully resolved the 12 outstanding questions that the IAEA...
Mark, I'm going to have to stop you there because, you know, when the UN resolution that sanctified the JCPOA was passed, it took Iran out of the doghouse as far as the UN Security Council was concerned. That was a key demand of the Iranians. So no, they are no longer in the same boat with North Korea. You may say that they did not answer these questions to all of our satisfactions, and I think that's very clear. But from a UN perspective, they're out of the doghouse, and of course they haven't developed and tested nukes, which North Korea has done. So you're trying to say that Iran is still in the doghouse, and the whole purpose of the JCPOA from Iran's point of view was to get out of this.
Well, again, Barbara, Ali asked me my opinion on this, my perspective, and I think it'll be a perspective that will be shared by the Trump administration. So we can have this debate, but I'm sure you're more interested to know going forward as a matter of U.S. policy. I think that there are serious concerns that these questions were not resolved, that Iran's nuclear program, that there are scientists and there are sites and there are documentation that we never were able to actually access. And I don't see the Trump administration giving Iran a clean bill of health. And I certainly don't see a Trump administration accepting that this Iranian regime is going to be entitled, as a matter of these deeply flawed sunset provisions, to emerge with an industrial-sized nuclear program with near-zero nuclear breakout and an advanced centrifuge clandestine sneak-out option. I don't think they'll accept it. And so the real question will be, do I think they'll abrogate the deal? No, I don't think they'll abrogate the deal. But I do think they'll use the Joint Commission. I do think they'll use non-nuclear sanctions. I do think they'll have a zero-tolerance policy with respect to Iranian violations. And I think that there will be an attempt to lay the predicate for pressure, not to drive the Iranians away from the table, but to lay the predicate for a follow-on negotiation to address some of the fundamental flaws of the deal that both we see and the Iranians see. If the Iranians are not getting the sanctions relief they want, then there's an opportunity to come to the table, negotiate a JCPOA 2, and get the relief they want, but that's going to require concessions.
I think that's a really important point. Jim, I just wanted you to come in on, you know more about North Korea than most people in this room.
Well, let me talk first about, I think there's some confusion here. So the notion that Iran is going on year 15 to build an industrial scale enrichment capacity is a guess, right? I mean, you don't know that that's going to happen. No one knows if that's going to happen or not. I also find it
they're entitled to.
Well, sure, being entitled and doing are different things. Number two, you don't need, what state built an industrial-sized enrichment capacity to have a nuclear weapons program? South Africa had a tiny program. The North Koreans had a tiny program. This is industrial scale has nothing to do with whether you can build a nuclear weapon or not. And as the DNI has already pointed out, they already know how, they have the capacity to do it if they choose to do it. The whole idea that we can technically limit this, that was gone a long time ago. That was gone after they built the second 1,000th centrifuge. This is a political problem. And the idea that we're going to solve this with technical limits on their program is just not true. At the end of the day, the best way to prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear weapon state is for it to see that it's in its interest not to become a nuclear weapon state. That's what the agreement is really about. That's what the NPT is about. That's how these agreements work. Let me say on sanctions, I think Mark is absolutely right, and brave to be here with so many contending voices, and absolutely right to say that the U.S. reserves all policy instruments to deal with the challenges that Iran poses. But context is very important here. All right, how do we judge whether something has the intention of undermining the deal or simply a response to behavior that Iran is taking that we don't like? Analogously today, if you say all through your campaign you want a Muslim ban, you want a Muslim ban, you want a Muslim ban, and then you have an immigration order and you say this is not a Muslim ban, it's going to look that way to people, okay? It technically may not, but it's certainly going to look that way. Now, it seems to me if we want to stop Iranian behavior, that's a valid public policy question, but we don't, this knee-jerk thing that says they do something bad, sanctions, that makes no sense to me. I mean, the academic literature on sanctions correcting human rights violations, not very good. In fact, evidence would suggest it makes them worse, not better. On things that Iran sees as its national self-interest, like its military, I don't think you're going to sanction them away from a missile program when Iraq shot missiles at them during the Iran-Iraq war. I just don't think that's going to work. Now, you should think about that as a policy instrument, but you should assign some probability here. What is the probability this is going to achieve our policy objective? And then you weigh it against the costs. So the cost here is we can sanction the hell out of the IRGC, and we can try to cripple them. So then do they become a voice for nuclear restraint in Iran? Is that how it works? That's rather than, as you point out, they seem to be benefiting from the agreement. That would seem to suggest that they have a self-interest in its continuation. Isn't that actually what we want to have happen, is the agreement to continue rather than fall apart? Now, I agree absolutely that we should consider follow-on agreements. I think that's fabulous, but we shouldn't confuse follow-on agreements and renegotiation. Yes. So you don't come out after the first 365 days and say, I want to do it over. That's renegotiation. You let this sit for a while. Hopefully you build some sustainable relations so that we're just not insulting each other every other day, a little trust, and then you say, year 3, year 5, how can we make this better? How can we make it better for you? How can we make it better for me? But you don't do it, before the first birthday has passed. And so I think we're not going to renegotiate, because if we call that meeting, we'll be the only ones there. And that'll make it really tough.
So, Jim, we all agree that we're going to negotiate a follow-on agreement, a JCPOA 2, and we agree it shouldn't happen in the first 100 days, and we agree it should happen when the United States has built, number one, the negotiating leverage, so we can actually negotiate a proper follow-on agreement, and number two, we've worked very closely with our allies to lay the table so that we can actually negotiate this. I think we're all in agreement.
Yeah, I would add a few more things to that, but yes, I would agree with those elements. There are other elements that would be important as well. But yes, I think I've said that from the beginning.
Yeah, you hit on something which, working with our allies, I mean, the sanctions did not really begin to impact Iran until the Europeans and the Japanese and the South Koreans came on board and stopped buying their oil. That's what. That's what did it.
That's not true. That's not true. And B, let's.
2012.
I spent a lot of time working on sanctions the past 13 years. Let's just remember the sequencing of this. Right? The sequencing of this is that the United States put in place very powerful secondary sanctions. They went around the world, particularly the U.S. Treasury Department went around the world and read the Riot Act to financial institutions not to do business with Iran. They then imposed billions of dollars of fines on banks that violated Iran sanctions. The U.S. Congress then came in 2010 and passed very powerful secondary sanctions, financial sanctions through SASADA, and then began an escalation where Congress began to pass tougher and tougher sanctions. At the same time, right, you had this powerful instrument of coercion where European companies and Asian companies were beginning to fear that they were going to get cut off from the U.S. market. Everybody was afraid the Israelis were going to bomb Iran. And so all of us were looking for a non-nuclear or, say, non-military way out of this crisis, because we all feared that an Israeli military strike would lead to massive escalation. And so the Europeans finally came to the table recognizing they needed a made-in-European solution because they didn't want Israeli military strikes and they didn't want U.S. financial sanctions and billions of dollars of fines being imposed on their companies. And then the Europeans came to the table and they put in sanctions.
2012 was the real, that national defense.
Let's remember the sequencing of this. The Europeans finally came once we were pretty far up the escalation curve because they recognized these threats. And so when we talk about reconstituting pressure so that we can get a JCPOA 2, of course we have to work with the Europeans and our allies to ensure they're on board. But one should never underestimate, number one, the power of U.S. financial sanctions, and number two, forget about an Israeli military strike. As somebody who supports sanctions, not military strikes, one should always fear a U.S. military strike under the Trump administration, which could begin with an escalation in the Gulf the next time an IRGC attack boat harasses one of our Navy ships, and President Trump orders Secretary Mattis to blow that out of the water. Then you could imagine an escalation that leads to military confrontation. And so when we talk about non-nuclear sanctions, that may be the least confrontational, coercive instrument that we may face in the next 4 years.
Do you want to react to any of that, Caroline?
Of course, there's always a final solution to everything. You can always escalate everything as far as one wishes, and the end is something that we all want to avoid, I think. I think what is important is that to understand that this deal, it takes two to tango, and if we don't keep the Iranians on board, there is no purpose with the deal. Therefore, I also want to point out, so it's been said, that the EU still maintains sanctions on Iran for human rights and terrorism. So we haven't lifted all our sanctions. But it certainly needs, I think, and we work with China, we work with Russia to try to maintain a sort of positive incentive for Iran to maintain this. This will, of course, be more complicated if the pressure increases from the U.S. side.
Yeah.
That's clear, and I cannot say where the break point is for something like that, and that is, of course, to the U.S. side. The U.S. Congress has to take that into consideration because there is just so much you can do with the carrot if the stick is beating faster and faster, and that is political judgment where but certainly the other partners of the deal, and we have not, I must repeat, I prefer to remain in good faith of this new administration, that we will be able to work very well together, and that we will be able also to discuss this with the members of Congress openly, and that we will be able to maintain this deal moving forward. And the further we get into the deal, I think, the better it is.
Mm-hmm. Did you want to add something, Ellen? Or?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I thought that Mark's chronology of how sanctions worked was very useful and worth reminding ourselves that this did happen under an administration that wanted to engage with Iran. Okay, so coercive diplomacy worked. Yet, the Iranians would tell the story differently.
Sure.
They would say that they were ready to talk when they were ready to talk, and that might have had to do with some of their technological achievements, not just the economic pressures. So we've got a Rashomon problem here of what is it that brought people to the table and what were their assumptions about the other actor. I guess what I find a little bit disheartening is the notion that it is there is a profound lack of trust. The Iranians are doing more stuff that we don't like. The problem seems, in a way, to be getting worse, not better.
Yeah.
And I guess I do have, if we revert back to an all punitive psychology about dealing with Iran, we haven't learned a lot from history, okay? It seems to me that we still need to be a little self-critical of decades that went by when we did not succeed in changing the Iranian calculation of what was in their interest. As you said, how do we get under their skin? How do we get them to rethink what's in their interest. And maybe that's beyond our capability. Maybe Iran always wants to be an outlier country in a way. The revolutionary fervor is at least alive and well for some, not for many, but maybe this Iran cannot change in the direction that we wish that it could. So I guess I'm taking away from this, it's a little bit turning the clock back to a mindset about managing the Iran challenge in ways, and that maybe the JCPOA survives as a minor piece of the bigger puzzle, but that larger story is getting darker, not lighter.
I think it's a great point. And I would recommend not going back to an all-punitive approach. I'd go back to the Obama approach, which was a dual-track approach, which is using punitive measures like sanctions and hopefully under a Trump administration, other instruments of American coercion beyond sanctions, and also offering the Iranians all the time an opportunity to sit down and negotiate a follow-on agreement that addresses the fundamental flaws of the agreement as we see it and as they see it. And I think that's an opportunity to go not back to the all punitive, but to actually offer a dual path.
Mark, would you support a complete lifting of U.S. primary sanctions on Iran if it were to take steps that would actually, forswear forever its ability to make a nuclear weapon? And you were satisfied with that?
Well, first of all, the Iranians forswearing their right or their right never to build a nuclear weapon is, for me, not a guarantee of anything. The Iranian forswearing anything.
For example, if they agreed to have no more than 300 kilograms of low-enriched uranium in perpetuity, in which case they could not, build a nuclear weapon.
Look, I'm not going to start, a negotiation about what this JCPOA agreement should look like. I think actually that is a great way for deal opponents and deal supporters to come together and to start to think through, from a policy perspective, what an agreement would look like. What are we prepared to do? What do we think they're prepared to do? And by the way, on what they're prepared to do, I think we should not fall into the trap that the Obama administration did, which is where we start to negotiate with ourselves. And this notion that we will only ask something that we think they're prepared to give. I think that's a big mistake. By the way, I completely agree with your analysis on this, on how what brought the Iranians to the table in the first place. I mean, I absolutely think sanctions brought them to the table. I think that's something the DNI agrees with. But I also think that one of the biggest things that brought them to the table was our willingness to give them up front a major concession. In fact, two major concessions. One was on enrichment, and to abandon decades of U.S. policy on enrichment. And number two was to actually give them a way out of these permanent restrictions on their nuclear program, which again were decades of U.S. policy. That the construct that we used to have was that the Security Council would vote in the affirmative to lift restrictions on Iran's program, and the United States and France and other countries had a veto on that. We actually, Secretary Kerry, others, offered these huge concessions at the beginning of the negotiation, which I think was a big mistake. It absolutely brought them to the table, but it resulted in a deeply flawed deal with sunset provisions and an enrichment capacity that's going to expand over time.
I thought we weren't going to relitigate
Let's
the
not
JCPOA,
relitigate.
but
Let's
I
not
do have something to say here. I have lots to say, but I'll keep it to one thing.
No, you won't.
It's not an unreasonable guess. So Mark said something. Now, he may have just misspoke. I can tell you, I misspeak when you're up in front of an audience or on TV. But he did or he didn't. But if the Iranians are listening, this is what they heard him say. We need to increase our leverage on Iran. We need to put on the pressure so that when we go into a negotiation for JCPOA 2.0, we can use this pressure and get an agreement we want. Now, that sure sounds to me like we're using sanctions for a nuclear agreement, even though that's prohibited under the JCPOA. Now,
I didn't misspeak.
Well, Mark,
I did not misspeak,
well,
and that is absolutely not in contravention of the JCPOA.
Well, I think the cat's out of the bag,
Wait a
friends.
second. The notion that we cannot pressure the Iranians in any way, because of the nuclear deal means what I always suspected it meant, was that we were going to paralyze U.S.-Iran policy. We were effectively going to,
Mark,
the JCPOA...
we have primary sanctions on Iran. We already have enormous
But
sanctions.
clearly the idea that we're using sanctions on human rights and this other stuff, and it's purely because of that, and it's not to get leverage over nuclear. Well, that just went away, my friends. That just, that's up in smoke.
Guys, unfortunately, I hate to tell you.
Nice try, Tim.
I hate to tell you, but our keynote speaker, I believe, is about to arrive. Yes? Do we have time for one more question, Ben? Or
I'm sorry we ate up all the time.
That's right. So we have time for one more question. I'm going to go right here. And wait for the microphone, if you would. Do we have a microphone? Yeah. Pass it down. Yeah.
Well, as a person who spent a good bit of time in Iran and has lived and worked with people in Iran on higher ed,
Just
hold it up to your mouth.
my specialty is higher education in Iran and the U.S. And at least from my perspective, I must say I very much agree with Ellen and Mark's point of view, and well, Caroline's as well, that respect is a basic necessity in the situation. Context is huge. I think the idea of technically muddling the Iran agreement, the nuclear agreement, with all of the other objections we have to their behavior is a hugely dangerous thing to do. Everyone thinks, I think, that the current agreement works well. It is well constructed. It specifically separates all of those very important issues from the other issues precisely in order to get nuclear proliferation done.
Tom, do you have a question?
Yes. So my question is, what possible benefit could there be, and what can we do to educate the anti-agreement folks on the Hill? As I represent the National Peace Corps Association from Iran, and I think we need to educate people on the Hill to the best we can. Context and respect is where we need to go, and I don't know how to do it given the kind of very dangerous idea that somehow muddling human rights and other things, which are huge, with the nuclear agreement is going to achieve anything other than disaster.
Carolyn, I know that the EU and European diplomats in general are trying to do this. Others are trying to do this.
Yeah, I think we are looking to engage with the new Congress now, if they and when they start to think about doing this. We are a bit waiting to see what comes out of this new administration as well, but we are certainly ready to go up again. We were very present there in view of the decision on the JCPOA in Congress, and I think we were able to help together with Russia and with China. We were present there, and we are ready to do that again because we think this is worth defending, and we also believe that we can help out in Iran by engaging with Iranians and the Iranian society at a breadth on different topics: higher education, environment, industrialization, small and business, and many other areas where we go in from the EU side to engage and also try to build confidence in this agreement, and build confidence and also feel that a larger part of the society actually benefit from it, even if it doesn't come in money.
Those of you or those here who have direct knowledge of how things happen on the Hill, which many of us folks do not, what specific actions can we?
The question is about what specific actions. Well, I think that we've seen just since President Trump came into office that there has been a tremendous resurgence of willingness on the part of ordinary Americans to call their members of Congress on a variety of issues. And I think you could probably add the Iran nuclear deal to the long list of things that people are now talking about with members of Congress and issues that they think are worth preserving. And I also say the Atlantic Council stands ready to educate members of Congress and their staff about not just the nuclear agreement, but other aspects of Iranian policy, domestic realities, and so on. We're committed to explaining the complexity of this society to a broader audience in Washington and outside. With that, I'm afraid we've come to the end of this panel. We're going to have a brief coffee break, so go and get a coffee or a snack, and then we will come back to hear Senator Chris Murphy give his address. And thank you very much to my panelists.
Thank you. Thank you.